In this video, I want to look at the book of Genesis and marriage. The book of Genesis is the book of beginnings. It tells us about how God created the world, how God created life, how he created humans and nations and his people. And it also tells us how God created marriage. And so let's look and begin in Genesis by looking at the biblical definition of marriage. A lot of people wonder, what is marriage? Our politicians are debating, what is marriage and can we change the definition? Well, here's what God's definition of marriage is from Genesis 2:24. He says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." See, we read this right after God has created Eve, and Adam meets her for the first time, and Adam's just excited. He says, "This is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh." He says, "I love her. I'm amazed by her." And God says, here's what marriage is. A man leaves his father and his mother. The woman does the same, and they cling to each other in one flesh relationship. A couple observations from this definition of marriage. Marriage is presented as a heterosexual relationship. That's just how it is in Genesis 2. It's a heterosexual relationship. The couple is clearly a man and a woman. And so this is how the Bible presents marriage to us in Genesis chapter 2. A couple other observations I want to make from the first couple chapters of Genesis. One is that God created unique gender roles for marriage. In Genesis 2:18 through 20, we see that Eve had a different role to play than Adam. In verse 18, God says this. He says, "It's not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him." So God recognized that although Adam was in the garden and he was sinless and everything was great, he got to hang out with God, it was still kind of bad because he was alone. And so God says he needs a helper. And so verse 19, we read how all the beasts of the field came forward and Adam named them. But verse 20, it says this, "The man gave names to all livestock and to the birds of the heavens and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper fit for him." None of the animals could be a suitable helper for Adam. And so God created Eve to complement Adam. I think it's really interesting. God, when he created a human, he created a person. He didn't create another man. He created a woman who would complement Adam, who would have a different role to play than Adam would play. Now, some of you are thinking, well, this was all before sin entered the world. Maybe once people sinned, it changed everything. But we find in Genesis 3:16 through 19, after Adam and Eve sin, God upholds these gender roles. And so not only does God create marriage, but he creates unique gender roles for men and women within the context of marriage. And one last thing I want to point out from Genesis 1, and this is really important, I think, for this whole discussion, is that procreation is part of God's plan for marriage. Look at what Genesis 1:28 says. Genesis 1:28, this is the first command that God ever gives a human in the Bible. It says, God blessed them, God blessed Adam and Eve, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Now, if we just stop for a second, I have to say this is the one command that humans have gotten right. Like, this is the only time we've ever listened to God and didn't have done what he said. We have children. But what we see here is that procreation is an important part of marriage. It's not the only reason we have marriage, but that marriage is the context for us to have children, to grow the human race. And so this commandment, of course, assumes heterosexual marriage relationships. And so I wanted to walk through Genesis, the beginning chapters of Genesis, real briefly, just to help us see as we think of homosexuality. Let's first begin by thinking of God's design for marriage and sexuality, and then sort of figure out, well, how does homosexuality fit into this? So let's discuss this question. How does understanding God's plan for marriage help us think through the issue of homosexuality?